the question of how well off people are, and by the way, I should note, this is going to be sort of American-centric, all right, but much of what I'm going to say applies to other places in the Western developed world as well. But how well off Americans are is a question that gets debated all the time, both in the popular press, but among academics as well. And there's all kinds of problems with this question of how well off we are. What do we mean by well off, right? There's a whole number of ways. Do we mean income? Do we mean wealth? Do we mean the stuff people have in their houses? Do we mean happiness? Do we mean other measures of well-being like literacy, longevity, whatever it may be? And what I'm going to do in the next 52 or 3 minutes, I hope, is to explore several aspects of this whole large set of issues. I can't give you a definitive answer to, are Americans better off today than we were X years ago? I'm going to give you a lot of evidence, but as you can see, what we mean by well off and how we might measure it are all very, very controversial kinds of things. But I at least want to raise some important questions and, more importantly, give you a whole bunch of data to think about. In fact, unlike my prior PowerPoints, almost every slide on this one, with a couple exceptions, is data. Okay? And so I'm going to put the data up and then talk some about it. And what I think is particularly nice is that I think that the sets of questions these data address are ones that have come up during the course of the week. We've talked about issues of inequality in Chris's talk yesterday when we talked about redistribution and the Rawlsian stuff. We've talked, again, about happiness, about well-being in both some of my talks and Tawny's talks. So, and we certainly have, from David, got a kind of historical sense of the evolution of liberty and of issues there as well. So I'm hoping that this data kind of brings together a whole bunch of things that we've talked about, and at the same time gives you guys some things that you can rely on to make the case with other people for the power of markets and the power of capitalism. To sort of anticipate the conclusion, I think the theme here is that there's never been a better time to be alive and on the planet, particularly in the Western world. And that, in fact, Americans, by and large, are much better off today than we were, pick any year in the past. And the data is there to show it. And more importantly, the reason we're better off is our friend in the middle there, capitalism. And let me sort of head off one question at the start. Obviously, we live in a mixed economy, right? And so making a claim that capitalism is responsible for how much better off we are at least has to confront the idea, well, maybe it's not capitalism, maybe it's the interventions that are there. I hope I can make the argument that it's really these long-term sort of secular forces of capitalism that are responsible, but certainly feel free to challenge me in the Q&A if you think that there's other explanations. So, here's the overview. Are the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer? Probably heard that claim before. And what about the question of income mobility? What exactly do the poor, and in fact the middle class, have in their houses? And how does it compare to poor folks in the past? How does it compare to the middle class in the past? Are people better off in terms of consumption than they have been in the past? Are Americans happy? Does wealth make people happier, or is it all just subjective? And then finally, are we in some sense objectively better off? Can we look at some indicators of well-being and say that we're better off? And how might this relate to wealth? So those are the kind of questions that we're going to answer, or try to answer in the next little bit. So let's start with inequality. And I want to present some data. This next bit of data is the one that people usually jump on to sort of indicate issues of inequality, actually the next two. This is a little old, from 1997. It's actually worse now, but this is useful enough. This is U.S. income earners by quintiles, by each 20% of households. And in 1997, the richest 20% of households earned over 49% of total income in the United States. The upper middle class folks, 23, middle 15, fourth 8.9, and then the poorest 20%, 3.6%. You can, by the way, think back to the choices you faced last night in Chris's little exercise. And this is something people point to and say, wow, look how unequal we are, right? Look how much the rich have a lot, the poor have a little, right? That's bad. Here's another bit of data that people sometimes use. Here's that same data for 1997 with the top and bottom compared to 1975. Right? In 1975, the top 20% had 43%. They're up over 6 percentage points. And the lowest 20% has actually fallen by almost a full percentage point. So, say people, aha! From 75 to 97, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Now, you might say, well, wait a second. Maybe not so fast. What if I said to you the following? Would you rather have a sixth of a pizza or a ninth of a pizza?
Depends on how big the pizza is.
Say that nice and loud, Casey.
Depends on how big the pizza is.
Depends on how big the pizza is, right? It could be a sixth of a real small pizza, but a ninth of a real large one. Okay? So one of the questions we have to ask when we look at these data on percentage of the income distribution is how much income are we talking about? And it turns out, by the way, that for these two dates, the change in the average income of wealthy folks was about $37,600, and poor folks gained $207. So they got a little tiny bit bigger piece of pizza. Not a lot, but a little tiny bit bigger. So at least one, you could say, well, at least they didn't really get poor, but they didn't get very much. They didn't get much wealthier over that period. And again, if that were all we were going to say, we'd have a difficult case to make to sort of object to the claim that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. However, there's a much bigger problem with these data that we need to look at. The problem is this. The fact is that the people who are rich in one year are not all the same people who are rich in the next year. And the people who are poor in one year are not the same people who are poor the next year. There is fluidity among those quintiles, what we call income mobility. Okay, people move up and they move down. Making this kind of comparison, you have to be very careful, because there's a temptation to say, see, all the rich people in 75 got richer, while all the poor people got poorer. That's not what that says. What that says is the people who were rich in 75 had this amount, and the people who were rich in 97, who, by the way, might well be very different people, had this amount. And same thing with the poor. So one question we might want to interrogate this with is, how similar, are they the same? How do people move up and down or in and out of those quintiles? And it turns out we've got a great deal of data about this question of income mobility. So for example, I'm going to first give you some data from 1979 to 1988. This is based on U.S. Treasury Department data, a very well-known right-wing source. Okay, so you can, if you think it's biased the wrong way, that's how you know. And I want to ask you to think about a question. The question is this. Of the people who were poor in 1979, what percent do you think were still poor in 1988? Keep it to yourself if you want to really, write it down if you really want to, if you're confident. What percent of people who were poor in 79 were still poor in 88? There's your answer right there. 14%. Put differently, 86%, rounding, of the people who were poor in 79 were no longer poor in 1988. And the way to read this table is the following. Here is where people were in 79. So of the people who were in the middle class in 1979, go across and it'll tell you what percentage of them were where by 1988. What this data does is track actual households. Every year, what the Treasury did was look at income tax returns from households every year, and the same households every year, and sort of watch how their annual income changed. So people in the middle class in 79, it's actually 6% almost, fell to the lowest 20%. 14% fell a quintile to lower middle class. A third stayed the same, but 46, 47% up, actually almost 48%, 47% moved up. Yeah, 47 point something. Moved up to the top 20% or higher.
What about the pizza arguments?
What about it?
I mean, if the pizza's bigger, and yeah, it might have gone down, but won't it be more in the end?
Hold that thought. We're going to come back to that. So, but what's interesting about this, I think, is, look, what happened to the poor folks? 86% of them moved up. Only 14% remained poor. And notice, by the way, even among the if you look at the tip-top rich folks, the top 1%, yeah, most of them stayed up there, but some of them took a pretty good fall. Not a lot, about 13, 14% fell at least one full quintile. And even among, if we spread that out to the top 20%, right, some 20%, 30, 35% fell at least one quintile. That suggests that there is significant income mobility in the United States. In other words, for the poor folks in 79, most of them got richer by 88. Here's another set of data, 1975 to 1991, from another notorious left-wing source, the University of Michigan's panel study on income dynamics, my alma mater. This is a much longer period of time, right? 16 years. Anyone want to guess what the upper left-hand corner is on this one?
11.
11? Other guesses?
15.
15, so about the same as the 9-year period?
8.
What? Now everyone's afraid.
8.
8?
50.
5.
Who said 5? Very good. The rest of you all overbid. It's the Price is Right and you all overbid. Okay? From 75 to 91, 5% of households remained in the lowest 20%. 95% of households got up and out of that lowest 20%. And again, you can read this table the same way you read the other one. So this suggests if we look over even longer period of time, and let me note, by the way, here's my favorite part about both of these data sets. Both of these data sets cover the greedy, nasty 80s, right? The decade of greed. This is when the Reagan administration was punishing poor people. That would be actually, you need a little Nelson from The Simpsons there. Thank you. There you go. No. Okay. Doesn't look like poor people got punished to me. Looks like they did okay, right? And we do want to look at those absolute numbers, which we'll look at in just a second. Anyone notice anything strange about this, though?
Like some of the lower, not the very bottom, but some of the other ones stay pretty similar.
These, like this one?
Yeah.
Well, 23% stayed, a few fell, so about a quarter were either worse off or the same, but 3/4 moved up, right?
Where are the new bottom percent in 1994?
Excellent. Right. Where are the new poor people coming from? 95% of the poor people got out. Where are the new poor people? Are we importing them? Are they coming from the future? Where are they coming from? Okay. Where are the new poor people coming from? Anyone want to guess what the answer is? You guys and immigrants. Right, we're back to the other topic. Right, new entrants into the labor market. In a powerful way, what these data demonstrate is really just people moving through the life cycle of income. What happens? You get out of school, you don't make a lot of money first, and as for most people, as they move through their 20s and 30s and middle age and on into their prime earning years, they just move up through the ladder. But the problem, and you might say, okay, well, yeah, that's obvious. And then and the critic might say, yeah, well, okay, then it's really not that there's all this income mobility. It's just that people get wealthier as they get older. Yeah, that's right. Then you might as well take your other slide a couple slides ago and rip that up. Because if you're going to make those static comparisons between 75 and 97 and not take account of the fact that it's apples and oranges, it's different people moving through these income brackets, then your static comparison makes no sense. The fact that it's just part of the natural sort of process people go through, that doesn't undermine the case for income mobility. We do have income mobility. People move up and through these things. Now, I should say, that 5% is still a fairly large number of people. Okay, if we think in terms, that number of households that is in the millions. It's about 4 or 5 or 6 million households. Okay, so that's not a small number of people. A lot of them are maybe small households, but even if it's one person per household, that's millions of people who are stuck in poverty over a 16-year period. So one thing I want to say is don't misinterpret the argument here, okay? Don't misinterpret my argument as saying, oh, we don't have to worry about poor people. There's plenty we can do, right? There's plenty of people who need help. The question is, one, let's understand how many we're talking about. Let's understand the reasons they remain poor, and let's think very carefully about whether there aren't market solutions that would increase the probability of more people being able to move up and out. Okay, so don't, don't sort of take this as a kind of complacency about poverty, because I don't want that to be the message. This is real, okay, and it's a lot of people, but it's not. This data at least suggests it's not quite as bad as it looks. Someone asked about the absolute income change. Now again, this is back to the PSID data, this last slide. If you look at the actual households, again, and track them through time, here's what you get. In 1975, the average income of the poor households in 1975 was $1,263. Those same households had an average income in 1991 of over $29,000. Whereas the richest 20% in 75, these are all adjusted for inflation, had an income of just over $50,000, and they were at those same households were at $54,000 and change in 91. So what does this suggest? I suggest there's only one interpretation of this data, which is the rich got richer, but the poor got richer a lot faster. Right? And notice this, right? Notice something else here. If we were going to measure inequality here, be like, yikes. Okay? But listen carefully, among all the households in existence in 75, by the time those households got to 91, their income distribution was much more equal. Now, yes, in 91, there's a whole bunch of new households filling in the bottom. So if we wanted to look at the distribution of all households in 91, we'd have to go back and include ones not included here. But notice what this is saying, though. It is saying that over time, if we look at the exact same pool of households, their income gets substantially more equal over time. And yeah, rich folks got richer, but poor folks got a lot richer. Okay? And again, I think that's an important, if you think in terms of the pizza slice, right? That whatever the percentages were and all that, this is a much bigger piece of pizza here for those households than it was over there. Notice, by the way, on average, everybody got richer, right? No group on average fell. Again, that's the bottom's being filled in by again, immigrants, new entrants into the labor force. I think that's a really important and result to keep in mind. There's been a lot of criticism of this data. When I first started giving this talk about 10 years ago using this data, the data was relatively new and everyone, ooh, that's great. And since then there's been a lot of back and forth about the data. There's been some criticism that suggests, particularly that this data, the PSID data, the 5% thing, probably overstates the degree of income mobility. It's probably not quite that good. And we do have one more recent data set. This is the Treasury again. This is 1996 to 2005. So this is another data set. And you can see here, this doesn't look quite as good, right? I mean, 42% still there is not so good. We did have a recession in there too and some other things, and there may be some biases from the year that we took. But still, nonetheless, over half of the poor families got out of poverty over that 9-year period. Again, if this data is in fact more accurate. And we see the same kinds of things too. Even among the next to lowest poor, a few fell, right? But 50% again moved up a quintile over a 9-year period. So this isn't quite as nice, and in sort of, intellectual honesty compels me to sort of give you the data that doesn't look quite as nice as the other data. There remains a very lively debate in the journals and the blogs and all these places over just who's got the better data here. One of the arguments that the defenders of the earlier data make is that the PSID isn't dependent upon tax returns. It covers all kinds of households. Looking at tax returns might bias this data in ways that make it look worse than it really is. So there's again, all kinds of debates going on. And all I want to suggest to you is that if you're going to talk about these issues, you need to be familiar, at least with what's going on here. Let me make one last point about all of this. Alan Reynolds from the Cato Institute has made another interesting point here. He says, look, as overall income grows, especially as the folks in the lower quintiles get richer, the dividing lines between the quintiles increase. In other words, it's like an accordion expanding. So as everybody gets richer, what it takes to be in each 20% becomes more and more. So as societies get richer, it becomes actually more difficult to move up a quintile even if you are getting wealthier. Right? Follow me? You could be getting wealthier, but if the quintiles are expanding, right, you just don't quite have enough to get over the hump, where 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that change might have been enough. And so what Reynolds argues is that might explain why we see not quite as much mobility here, because this was a period of fairly rapid growth, even with that recession around 2001, and that growth may reflect the stretching of those quintiles, making it tougher for people to get out of a quintile, even if they're getting richer within it. So that, I think, is an important point to keep. And they will also, by the way, stretch more at the top, right? So we would expect, the sort of super rich are there. Last point about this I'll make. A related question sometimes people bring up, is the middle class shrinking? Is the middle class disappearing? This data can't really of itself answer that question, but it's suggestive, right? Because it does suggest that of the folks who started in the middle class in 1996, a third are still there, 25% slipped, but 42% moved up. So that suggests that one thing that's happening to middle class families over time is that they are becoming wealthier. And in fact, one of the pieces of data that we've seen from other sources recently is that between 1979 and I think the end date on this data is mid-2000s, like 2005, that it's true that it's true that the middle class is shrinking and that fewer people today live in households with incomes between 30 and 100,000. And that's a very generous notion of the middle class, by the way. So fewer people today live in households with between $30 and $100,000 in income than they did in 79. Okay? But the reason for that is that the number of people living in households who earn above $100,000 doubled from 12% of the population to 24%. There was no increase in this data in the percentage of people living in households making less than $30,000. So the reason the middle class is shrinking is that people are moving up. By the way, $30,000 to $100,000 is a very generous, again, definition of the middle class. Anyone want to guess how much income it takes? Last data I know is about 2007. What your household income would have to be in the highest 20%?
Isn't it over 250,000?
So I hear over 250,000 to be in the highest 20%. Other guesses? Anyone know? 60?
Yeah, 70.
70? See, now y'all guessing low because you know I got tricks up my sleeve. The answer is about 95,000. So if you live in a household that earns over $90,000, you're among the 20% of richest American households. By the way, you can also ask how rich you are in terms of the entire world. You're up in the fraction of the top percent. So again, that's some more data to think about here. All right, well, that's all about income. As I said at the beginning, that may not be the only way to talk about how well off people are. After all, as they say, you can't eat money. Right? The reason we care about earning incomes is that we want to be able to buy stuff with them. Right? So one question might be, well, what happens if we look at this data in terms of consumption? If we look at data in terms of, what kind of stuff do people have in their house? And so it turns out that the Bureau of Labor Statistics very conveniently does a survey every year that basically asks people, what do you got in your house? Okay? Or it says, do you have these things in your house? All right? And we've got this data going back, at least I have it, going back to 1984. So here's some interesting data. This is a very busy chart, so before you start trying to look at numbers, bear with me. What this says is what percentage of households had each of these items in their house at the time they were surveyed. The first column is poor folks, and that's people, the lowest 20% of income earners in 84, the lowest 20% in 94, the lowest 20% in 2003, the lowest 20% in 2005. This is all households in 1971. This is all households in 2005. All right? So what do you notice here? I mean, what stands out? Got a lot of stuff, right? One thing I think that stands out, if you just go across the first four columns and don't pay any attention to the last two, looks like the poor are doing much better, right? Washing machines, 58%, now 68%. Clothes dryer, 35 to 61. Dishwasher, more than double. Refrigerators up. Freezers down. Anyone want to guess why freezers are down? Because a lot of refrigerators now have freezers built into them. So that might be one reason. Stove is up slightly, but everybody's got a stove. Microwave, 12.5. Everyone's got, even poor folks, 91% have a microwave. Color TV, we take that for granted. VCR, love this one, right? Personal computer, pretty good. Telephone, pretty good. By the way, What explains this? Cell phones, right? Next one down, okay? One or more cars. I don't have the 2005 data, but I love this. This is 73% of poor households have one or more automobile. The next time, I mean, you know, it's hard to sort of complain if you think about what it means to be poor in America versus being poor in most of the rest of the world, right? You got people living on less than $1 a day. If you're poor in America, the odds are 3 to 1 basically that you've got a car, okay? And odds are, you know, pretty good you got all this other stuff. That's good, right? It's good that poor people, the being poor in the United States has enabled people to buy more, to have more of these stuff. And by the way, if you think these are just trivial, right? Air conditioners save lives. Cellular telephones save lives. Personal computers can save lives. All these things make it easier for poor folks to get jobs, to connect with family, to do all these. So these are not just stuff, right? Having a freezer and a refrigerator means your food's not going to spoil, right? And having a washing machine and a dryer means no trips to the laundromat. All those sorts. So these aren't just trivial. But I think it's really interesting to compare the poor in 2005 to the average American family in 1971. Right? Across most of those goods, poor folks in 2005 were more likely to have it than the average American was in 1971. In some cases, right, because the thing didn't really exist. You know what microwaves looked like in 1971? Yeah, huge, and you had to wear lead to use them. Right? So color TVs, right? I mean, all these things. Again, zeros here, obviously, but still, that's not irrelevant, right? Much different numbers, right? Cellular telephones didn't exist. Even the car number, right, is pretty interesting. And if you look at all 2005, if you just compare these last two columns, you can get a sense for the difference for the average American household over that 34-year period. So if we look in terms of consumption, right, things look pretty good. But someone might say, well, what about the equality question, Steve? Okay. Thank you. What about the equality question, Steve? Well, I took this data and played with it a bit. And what I tried to do, because you can look at the data and do this, and I just did it for 2003 and 2005, was to look at the gap between the lowest 20% of households and the top 20% of households in the percentage that have these different consumption goods. The raw data lets you do that, okay? Again, this is another busy chart, all right? But what it's showing, or busy table, what it's showing is, here's the poor and the rich in 2003. That number is the gap between them. In other words, that's the percentage point difference. So it's basically the second column minus the first column. Over here, I did the same calculation for 2005. And the final column here is the change in the gap. So in other words, a negative number there means that the gap between rich and poor closed. That the gap between the percentage of rich and poor households that had these goods closed. And this is the bottom 20% and the top 20%. So you can see for most of these goods over that 2-year period, again, it's only 2 years, the gap shrunk. There's a couple, like the stove blipped up a bit, okay? The VCR, big gap change there. Right? This one is interesting, right? The gap actually got worse on telephones. Again, why? Because the gap on cell phones fell dramatically. So for most of these goods, and even for the ones where it didn't fall, which is just these two, we've got, this one is like in the margin of error probably, and this one we've got a good explanation for. So essentially, for all of these goods, just about all of them, the gap between rich and poor narrowed. So if we think in terms of consumption goods, right, it's a little harder to make this case that the gap between rich and poor has expanded. And the interesting question here is, what makes this possible? Why have we seen this falling gap? And that's where we want to do another little bit of data and a little bit of calculation. I mean, one way to think about the real cost of goods and services is to ask the following question: How much of our lives does it take to make that good? How many hours do we have to work to be able to afford, actually, it would be a better word than make, to afford that good? So if we think for a moment, all right, if we can buy an iPod for $200, let's say, how many hours of work does it take to earn the $200 we need to buy the iPod? So we might want to do some kind of calculation where we say, well, what's the average wage for Americans? let's say, the average private sector wage. We'll leave those rich, cushy government jobs out of it for now. Okay? The average private sector wage, and we have data on this going back decades. And then we can say, all right, at the average wage, how many hours would it take to purchase this good in a particular year? And we can compare the changes in the hours of work it takes to do that. And that reveals some very interesting data. I've got a whole bunch of data on this. I'm going to show you one table in a second. But there's really interesting stuff. For example, I have data from 1997 which shows the computing power of 1 million instructions per second in 1997 versus 1920. Like in 1920, it would have cost you 500 and some odd thousand lifetimes of work to purchase that. Today, it's a fraction of $1, right? So that's the way to think about this. So here's some detail on exactly the same kinds of stuff we were just looking at. So take the washing machine. In 1973, you could buy a washing machine for $285. Today, you can buy it for $400. But the difference, of course, is when we look at the hours of work. In 1973, the average private sector wage was $4.12 an hour. Today, it's $18.72 an hour. So if we do the math, it would have taken the average industrial or average private sector worker almost a little over 69 hours of work to buy that washing machine then. Today, it takes just a little over 21 and a half. And that final column on the right is the change in the number of hours it takes to purchase those goods. And you can see this is like a sweep, right? There's no ambiguity here, right? Every single one of these goods is substantially cheaper in terms of the hours it takes to work. Even if the price, right? I mean, the price didn't change that much here, but when you look at it in terms of hours of work, you can see the difference, right? Toasters are more expensive in terms of the retail price, but it's, about a fifth, fourth in terms of the hours work. Vacuum cleaner, all the rest. So one explanation for why it is that we see this gain in everyone's consumption of goods and services of all these goods, but particularly that of the poor, is the degree to which it's simply easier to buy these goods in terms of hours worked. One example of this, by the way, I'm old enough to remember when I was young. I'm old enough to remember when I was young that when someone called your house long distance, that was like a big deal, right? And if you made a long distance call, right, it was keep it short, right? Why? Because it costs, right? It was, many cents, not this zero we pay now, right? Not even the 10 cents a minute when cell phones first came out, right? But this was like $1 a minute. Okay? And so when you made a long distance call, that was a big deal. And then when you factor in this sort of hours of work thing, that was expensive. And it was like, if you're going to call long distance, you better make it fast. Right? Again, what's the cost of calling long distance now? Zero on the margin, right? Marginal cost is zero. It doesn't cost you any more to call long distance. International, yeah, but not domestic long distance. So all of these, all of these kinds of changes reflect the ways in which markets and capitalism and competition have created innovation, driven down the real cost of purchasing these things. There's a place, and I should have put it in maybe I'll post it to the Facebook thing later, but there's a site where a guy has collected online a whole bunch of old Sears catalogs. And there's another site where a guy's collected all these old Radio Shack catalogs. And they're fascinating to look at, to sort of see what you could buy for how much money years and years ago. There's one example of, I think sometime in the 70s, in a Radio Shack catalog, where you could buy one of the nice stereo systems of the time, which was basically a turntable, a little tiny amplifier, and speakers, for $350. That was considered a decent price, $349.99, right? Is there a $349 up there? You can sort of get, right? I mean, it's about this many hours of work, right? And it was crappy, okay? To buy the equivalent, there's not even an equivalent thing today, right? You can get a really nice stereo system or boombox or MP3 player, whatever, for much less. Yeah, I know, I'm old. For much less than that, not even counting the change in hours of work, right? That's a significant transformation. But there's even one other more fundamental point here. What does this actually not capture that's really important about the change from 73 to 09?
Inflation.
No, it accounts for inflation by taking in it's comparing the actual retail price, but the inflation is built into the wage. Who said it? Someone just said it. Loud. Changes in quality. You ever seen a refrigerator from the 1970s? Yeah. Okay. You ever seen a color TV? Look. What this was, if you go look at what this TV was, my guess it was a huge 19-inch TV, okay? Color TV, picture quality was crappy, okay? Now, you can't quite get an LCD yet for this of any decent size, but they're getting there, right? For about $400 today, you could probably get a decent-sized LCD. That's just like a whole different appliance than that TV was, right? Even coffee pots. Back then, it was like a percolator, right? You know, you put the coffee. Now you get Mr. Coffee or whatever that's got a timer on it. I have one of those really cool ones that grinds the beans and it goes right. So it's a whole different thing. Think about, one of my favorites is think about automobiles. Right? I'm old enough to remember what cars were like in 1973. They sucked. Okay? And not just like the Pinto that blew up when you hit it in the rear end. Okay? They had nothing. You were lucky if you had a radio. I spent half my childhood riding backwards in a station wagon. All right? You're lucky. Actually, you're lucky if you had seat belts, too. But and sort of mechanically, they weren't very good. They got terrible mileage. If you had a car last 100,000 miles in the 70s, that was a miracle, right? Am I right, David? Am I right, Tom? Right? Today, if you don't get 100,000 miles out of your car, you got a crappy car. You expect to get 100,000 miles today. So changes in quality are huge here. And even washers and dryers, refrigerators with ice makers and meat drawers, and before it was just a big cold box. Okay? So all these changes in quality aren't even accounted for here. The way in which this process makes people's lives better off, I think, this data even understates it as presented. So again, if we want to think in terms of consumption, here's a way to think about it. All right. So that's income, that's consumption. Well, what about happiness? What about well-being? Happiness is really, really tricky. And a critic might say, okay, Steve. Okay. People have stuff, but are they happy? Don't repeat that. Okay. Right. People have stuff, but are they happy? Well, how would we know? Right? We could go out, we could try to ask them, are you happy? We could try to find other ways of doing this. And there's this whole literature now out there researching happiness. Could do a whole talk on this because there's all kinds of interesting issues and problems with this. But let me report at least 4 results that the happiness research literature seems to agree upon. And then we'll talk a little bit about what some of the problems might be. 1, the U.S. is among the happier countries in the world. However they measure it, the U.S. is among the happier countries in the world. 2nd, average happiness doesn't seem to change as countries get wealthier over time. This one's really interesting. As countries get wealthier, people don't seem to report being any happier. They're not any less happy. It just seems like happiness isn't related very much at all to the idea of getting wealthier over time. However, what happiness does seem to be correlated with is economic freedom. That the more free an economy is, the happier its citizens report they are, independent of wealth. Right? So this is a measure of economic freedom. Here's, again, however it's done, right? These measures of happiness. And it's not a tight line, but it's a pretty clear trend. Okay? So it does seem to be the case that when people feel as though perhaps they have more control over their lives, when they have more opportunities for entrepreneurship, when they have more opportunities to earn income and move up through those quintiles, that makes them happy. And it may be also that they feel as though when they have earned their place, right, when their income is a result of their own work, what psychologists would call a locus of control, right, that when you control your own destiny, that you're actually happier. Even if you had the same wealth, but it was given to you by someone else or redistributed towards you, it seems to suggest that people in that situation would not be as happy. The other thing that we know from this data is that life satisfaction seems to be correlated with GDP per capita. Now, this isn't quite happiness, okay? This is a little more Aristotelian, maybe, a little more eudaimonia or something, right? Where we're really talking about a bigger notion of life satisfaction. And again, it's not a beautiful fit here, but it's pretty good, right? It's pretty good that as GDP per capita goes up, people report having greater life satisfaction. So that suggests, there is some relationship, not just sort of happiness, but are you satisfied? Are you satisfied with your life? So again, that's what the data suggests. Let me raise some questions to think about with this data, because I really am fairly skeptical about what this is actually capturing. But let me say a couple of things. One question about the happiness stuff is, are we always looking up? Are we always judging our own happiness by the people above us, right? So as everyone gets wealthier, we say, well, I'm getting wealthier, but damn it, Bill Gates keeps getting wealthier, so I can't be any happier because I haven't moved up in relative terms. And this might be related to status, right? We talked about this in one of the earlier lectures. It may be that people associate income with status, and as everybody moves up, they don't gain in relative status, so they're not happier. It also may be the case that we have certain happiness set points, right? Here's the example makes this clear, and I just went through this myself recently. You buy the HD TV for the first time. I bought a 42-inch HD TV right around the first of the year. For that first month, you've got that HD TV. It's like, wow, right? This is great. This is. I can't watch regular TV ever again. This is great. And then after about a month, what happens? It's average TV, right? Do you love your HD? First month, do you love your HTV? It's amazing. 6 months later, you love your HTV? Yeah, I like it. It's great. Right? Because what's happened is your expectations have changed. Your set point has changed, right? That becomes, as it were, the new normal. And so maybe this is part of what happens with some of this happiness research too, right? As people become wealthier, it becomes the new normal. Think about this mental experiment. If I moved you backwards in time, would you be as happy as the people back then were? If I put you into France of the mid-18th century, would you be as happy there as the people are there, do you think?
No.
I think you'd be miserable. They might be reasonably happy. To them, that's normal. But you have a different notion of normal. You'd go there and be miserable, even though objectively you're living in the same society with the same opportunities. You'd be miserable, they'd be happy. Conversely, let's take someone from 18th century France and pull them forward into today, right? Put aside their confusion at the world that they would see, right? You'd recognize their world more than they'd recognize yours. Would they be happier? I submit that they would be happier than you are today in this world, right? Because they would recognize, right, all the differences in a way that we tend to forget the past. Once we get to the new normal, it's there. Again, there's all kinds of different things people mean by happiness as well, and that's a challenge in this research. And there's all kinds of problems with the methodology. And I have a video clip to show, Jeff. Uh-oh, come on. We're connected to the internet. This should work. Don't fail me now. Shoot. We give it a second, see if it comes up. I know you're in there. All right. We're going to do this the other way. Hang on. Come on, give me the desktop, you stupid thing. Hold on. What'd you just put in?
The sound.
Okay, because it just showed like it was picking up the internet. All right, let's see if we got it. Maybe we got it. I don't think so, but if not, we'll... Somebody sing us a song. No, it doesn't look good. Shit.
Yes.
Okay. Stop it. All right, it's because we're not connected. That's why. All right, we're not going to... what I'll do is during the break, I'll pull the clip up and I'll show it to you later. You may have seen... No, I know. Just... No, I'm not... It's not a tease. It's just delayed happiness, okay? So, well, I'll tell you what it is because you may have seen it. Shh. It's this Louis C.K. clip. Have you seen this? Yeah? Okay. Some of you have seen it. Yeah, it's great. But it's exactly this. I'll run it. I'll cue it up during the break, and we'll run it right before we do the Q&A. All right. Let me get to my last set of stuff here. So this suggests what all this suggests is that okay, the data seems to say we're reasonably happy by whatever measure of happiness we use, although we can admit there's problems with those various measures. But what about objectively? Are we better off in some sense objectively? And let's go to I'm not going to bother. We'll just do it the sloppy way here. Okay? Here's the best statement of this relationship between what we might call wealth and overall well-being in some objective sense. This is from a great paper, by the way, by Will Wilkinson of Cato, In Pursuit of Happiness Research, which really looked at all this stuff I've been talking about in the last couple slides. And he reports on a study of OECD, that should be of economies. Those guys found that the relationship between GDP per capita and various measures of well-being found significant positive correlations of GDP per capita, so wealth basically, with sufficiency, average years of schooling, life expectancy at birth, healthy life expectancy at birth, mortality risk, and volunteering. Right? Capitalism, morality, and freedom. Further, GDP per capita was significantly negatively correlated with income inequality, relative poverty, and child mortality. So, that's pretty good, right? If wealth has those positive correlations with the good stuff, negative correlations with the bad stuff, it seems to me that's a pretty good list of what we might call objective type measures of well-being. Those of you who know the Nussbaum and Sen literature, this might actually fit into some of that stuff as well, on the sort of conditions people need to live reasonable lives. It does seem like wealthier is healthier. Wealthier is better educated. Wealthier is lower rates of child mortality and the like. So that, I think, is a really important result. Let me actually make one quick note about infant mortality. You may have seen some data that criticizes the U.S. for having actually for its wealth and everything, a fairly high infant mortality rate. And a lot of people like to make out of Cuba's infant mortality rate is actually slightly lower than the United States. You see, that's why we need Obamacare or whatever the case may be. Let me tell you, that's an artifact of statistics, and it's an artifact of wealth. Here's why. The U.S. is so wealthy that we have the ability for mothers to give birth to live children prematurely that in many other societies would be stillborn. If the child's born stillborn, it doesn't count as ever being alive, therefore it can't count as being a case of infant mortality. It's stillborn. But if the child's born alive, say at 23 weeks or 22 weeks, and only half of those children actually survive, the ones that don't survive count towards the infant mortality rate. And so we look like we have a higher infant mortality rate than, say, Cuba, but that's because we have the ability to have infants survive at 22, 23 weeks that other societies don't. And those children would just die. And so it's an interesting question. Is it a better world where we can bring those children, get those children out and half of them survive than where they all die, they're all stillborn? I think it is. And if the cost of that is that we have a higher infant mortality rate, yay us. Okay? Because we're doing better at bringing people into the world. And that seems to me to be a good thing. Okay? That's an interesting question we can debate. But remember, one reason, it's very easy to have a low infant mortality rate if lots of pregnancies end in stillbirths. Right? That's the really sort of bottom line way to think about it. So that infant mortality rate data, I think, is just a little bit skewed, and you need to pay attention when people bring that up. Okay, so what do we get out of all this? I think what we get out of all of this is it's not clear at all that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. If anything, it seems to be the case that the rich are getting richer, but the poor are getting richer too, and in fact getting richer faster. And that income mobility, although we saw that there's some controversy there, is alive and well, at least to some degree. Right? How much is a matter of debate. But people have the opportunity to move up through those income quintiles. What's abundantly clear is that we are able to consume more today than we did in the past, and that poor Americans today live better than the average American family did in 1971, at least as measured by what they're able to consume. And certainly that poor families today live considerably better than poor families did 10, 20, 30 years ago in the United States. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that we aren't happy. or happy, reasonably happy. In fact, there's some evidence that the U.S. is a fairly happy place. And the reason we don't see happiness grow as we get wealthier may not be because we aren't happy in some objective sense, but rather that reported happiness is subject to these set point phenomena where we just adjust to a new normal and don't feel any happier, even though we may well be in some. If we could look at our past selves, we might well be. And finally, wealthier is healthier, right? Wealthier societies in which markets are free to generate that wealth, not only make people wealthier, makes them healthier, more years of schooling, better life expectancy at birth. We could have added, by the way, gender equality to this list as well, because that is correlated with a rising income. All these measures get better, or the bad ones, the good ones get better, the bad ones aren't as bad when wealth goes up. What does that suggest? It suggests that markets and capitalism, by making goods cheaper, by providing opportunities to people, are actually serving really valuable moral ends. And this is where I'm going to end, because I think the message of this is not just that we produce more stuff, but that producing more stuff, having money is nice, but we use it to make our lives better off. And when we have more stuff, we're able to do these things that we think are valuable, uses of valuable ways to improve human lives, right? Kids don't die. People live longer. People have longer life expectancies. Have more schooling. Literacy rates go up. All these things happen because we're wealthier thanks to capitalism. And it seems to me to go back to where we started this week. When we look at that last picture that Jeff showed, the factory, right? With the capitalism bringing you lower quality and higher prices or whatever it was since the 16th century, that is a bunch of nonsense. In fact, what capitalism does is just the opposite. And in doing that, has made the lives of humanity better off and continues to make them better off year to year. So I will stop there, breakout groups, and then we'll be back. And I'll have the clip for you when you get back to it.